Welcome back to Core 1929, Methods of Inquiry, Health and Wellbeing. I'm Dr. Rocco, and I'm excited to continue our series today on the narratives of COVID-19. And today we're going to talk specifically about some political dimensions of those narratives. Just a bit of housekeeping at the beginning. Note that your reading comprehension quiz is on D2L. You can take that as many times as you like until you get the score that you desire. But you can, I think, most productively use it as you go along with the lecture. So as I said, today we're going to talk a bit about the political dimensions of COVID-19 narratives. And specifically, we're going to talk about collective action, risk communication, and motivated reasoning. Now, I want to begin because you might be in this class on health and well-being and wondering, why is there a political scientist talking to me right now? And I think there are many good reasons for asking that question. Of course, one good reason is that we tend to think about politics and health as things that should be separate. There are good reasons for that. We think about politics as a domain of passions and preferences and interests. And health is something that's sacred and should be guided not by sort of political competition, but by a desire to find evidence that is relevant and is best for the health of the patient. So for one reason or another, however, I think it's going to be important to see the relationship between politics and health, because whether or not we like it, and sometimes there are good reasons for it, politics shapes health in profound ways. And so why would you use political science as a lens to study a pandemic? The first is to think about what the root word of health is. So health, the word, comes from the English root word hol, which means whole or holy. And whole or holy was a word that was used to refer to a community rather than to an individual. Community is sometimes referred to as the smallest unit of health. And if you think about your own experience of health, that probably makes a lot of sense. You're more likely to quit smoking if you're not around as many smokers. You're more likely to age in a better way if you are surrounded by your family as you get older. You are more likely to have better mental health status if you have adequate access to mental health providers in your area. Some people don't. So community matters in one way or another for our health. There is a particular type of community that we can think of as a political community, and that's what political scientists call a polity, which is just a form of civil government or a constitution. And all polities are defined by politics. Politics is usually, my students say, the thing that they're not allowed to talk about at Thanksgiving. It's the dirty word, probably again for good reasons. But what I talk about it as a political scientist, I just mean the process by which individuals or groups arrive at collective choices. So there's a politics to deciding where to go to dinner with your friends. It's just a process by which we arrive at collective choices. And collective choices affect a lot about our health. They affect who's licensed to provide care. For those of you who are in nursing school, at some point you're going to find out about scope of practice laws and what kinds of things nurses and doctors are allowed to do, and what kind of scope of practice nurses have. Who receives care and finances care? We talked about this in the last lecture, but national collective choices really affect who's able to receive care and how that care is paid for. The forms of care that we're able to receive can be affected by politics. Medical marijuana would be a good example of this. Is this a legitimate form of treatment for something? There's a political debate about that, as well as the cost, right? At what cost should the COVID-19 vaccine be distributed, and should we have to pay anything as individuals at all for that? All of those things are susceptible to political decision making. Now, we think about a pandemic, you're going to see that politics affects a lot about those choices. Specifically, we're going to talk about today, first, how pandemic management involves collective action problems, sort of signature thing that political scientists study. We're going to look at risk communication and how it can help to solve these problems, as well as what makes an effective risk frame. Third, we're going to talk about motivated reasoning and why people are susceptible to motivated reasoning during novel public health crises. And fourth, we're going to talk about motivated reasoning and how it shapes health behaviors during COVID-19. So when we think about a pandemic, right, these images are not going to be very surprising to you. We know that what matters in part is whether or not people take action that reduces the spread of the disease. Masking being one of the most important examples of this. We know that not wearing a mask increases the risk of spread, including from asymptomatic people. We also know that masking, as you see on the right here, reduced the relative increase in deaths across the country. Stay-at-home orders, another sort of collective behavior, if they're not in place, that has an effect on the relative increase in cases over the period of last spring. So we know that a lot about what matters in health and the management of a pandemic has to do with what we do collectively, collective action. I think that's specifically important now because we're seeing a rise in COVID-19 cases over the past 2 weeks in Wisconsin that is driven almost exclusively by an increase in cases among the 18 to 24-year-old age group, as you can see the green line here shows. And that is related to universities' decisions to reopen campuses for on-campus living and instruction. Now, exactly why this spike is so intense is sort of a subject of debate, but it's incontestable that it is this new wave of cases is being driven primarily by university reopenings. And this is true not just in Wisconsin, not just here in Milwaukee, but really around the country. This is the colleges with coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. And you can see there's a lot of variation here, but it's one thing that is driving a sort of increase in cases around the country. Now, one thing that we have to think about when we think about the increase in cases is collective action problems that might lead us to invest or under participate in public health positive behaviors. And when we talk about collective action problems, collective action really just refers to how individuals in a society reach a decision and implement it, and problems are just the dilemmas that arise when we try to arrive at and implement those decisions. When we talk about pandemics, we're going to talk about one specific type of collective action problem, which is a free rider problem. And this is a problem in which an individual incentive leads to the underproduction of a public good. A public good is a good that benefits everyone, regardless of whether or not you pay the cost of producing it. So regardless of whether or not you were diligently wearing a mask throughout the pandemic, diligently following social distancing guidelines and public health protocols, if we end up collectively reducing the spread of the virus, it's going to be hard to exclude you from that. Right? Clean air, clean water, public health are all public goods. I'm going to talk, to illustrate what a free rider problem is, I'm going to talk specifically about a public good that I use every day, which is public radio. So I wake up to it every day. It's a public good because even if I don't provide a voluntary contribution to public radio, which is the way that it gets funded, I get to enjoy it. Right? So I am a free rider because I enjoy the benefits of public radio, but I don't send in a contribution every year, largely because I'm still paying off debt and paying for housing and so on. But I don't send in contributions to public radio. But that's a problem in a way, because if everyone thought like I did, if everyone was a free rider, we might not have public radio. So why do these problems exist, right? What contributes to these sorts of problems where we might underproduce a public good? So when individuals can receive collective benefits, right, like public radio, clean air, clean water, without contributing, they might have an incentive to not cooperate in the production of that public good. Again, I get to wake up every morning, and regardless of what I do, I tend to know that public radio is going to be there for me. But the problem gets worse as the group of people who could potentially be involved in the production of that good gets larger and more diffuse. And to understand the reason why, you have to only think about two different musical ensembles, a string quartet and an orchestra. Now, if you are a member of a string quartet or band, let's say, and you don't show up for practice, it's going to be noticeable, right? The sounds of the quartet will change in a meaningful way. The absence of your contribution is going to be very, very noticeable. If you don't show up to practice and you're in an orchestra, now, some pieces of music, some instruments are very, very important, but in general, the effect on the overall sound will not be as substantial, right? There's a lower probability that your individual action as a member of an orchestra is going to matter for whether or not that public good, the sound of the orchestra, let's say, is going to be produced relative to your contribution to a string quartet. So the size of the group gets larger, the probability that your action is going to be the thing that makes the difference will go down. That might lead you to have less of an incentive to contribute to that public good. And so we can represent the propensity of someone to engage in a collective action with a kind of simple equation, I think, that helps my students typically understand why these problems emerge in the first place, why people don't mask, why people don't engage in social distancing, and so on. So think about the left-hand side of the equation here, R. That is the reward that you get for cooperating. And we generally think that if people don't get some kind of reward from cooperation, they're not going to engage in it. So we're trying to explain the sense of reward that people get from engaging in cooperative behavior. Now, on the right-hand side of the equation, the first term you're going to see is B. And that really stands in for the benefit from the production of the public good. So that's the benefit you get from having a pandemic-free society, or the benefit that you get from having public radio. And so you think about that as the reward you derive from, or the benefit you get from that public good being produced. But you'll notice that your individual reward and the benefit from that public good being produced are not the same thing. There's some other terms there in the equation. And that's really important because, again, it's not that I don't contribute to public radio because I don't like it a lot. I like it a whole lot. I don't contribute because of some of the other things in this equation. So let's go through them. So you notice that right next to B is a term called P. And that, you can think about that as the probability that the individual's action is necessary to bring about the benefit. So in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin generally, I know that I'm really insignificant when it comes to making sure that public radio gets produced. There are a lot of people here, there are a lot of people who like public radio. I know that I'm not that pivotal, which means that P in this equation for me is going to be very, very low, right? Like, think about like 0.000000001. Now, if I live in a really small town, let's say a town of 4 people, and there was a fledgling public radio station, and we're worried about whether or not it's going to actually bring about the benefit, my probability that my contribution would matter would be a lot higher, right? But notice that if my contribution, if the pivotality of it, the probability that my action is necessary is low, even if the term B here is super high, right? If P is 0.000001, multiply those two things together, that term gets really small, right? Which means that I might not have a reward, might not get a reward individually from cooperating, so I might not cooperate. But it actually gets worse than that, because every time that you engage in cooperative activity, it involves a cost, right? With public radio, I have to actually pay something, right? Monetary cost. I actually also have to like do the work of, getting out the credit card and, taking the time to dial up and all those sort of transaction costs as well. And with public health, the cost of individual cooperating is actually more intense than that, because to cooperate, it's not just about going out and buying the mask or staying home from work. In many cases, that can be costly in and of itself, especially if you're worried about being fired. But it's also the cost of learning what you need to know in order to understand the risks that you face, which is a cognitive cost. And that can really make collective action in a pandemic difficult, right? So that C might be really, really, really high. So if you think about a situation in which even if there's a large benefit, if the probability that you really matter, that you're going to be the one deciding person that makes that benefit come about is low, and what you're being asked to do is costly, right? You might not have anything like a positive reward from cooperating, right? And so we'll underproduce that public good. Right? Now, you might be thinking at this point, well, then why do people wear masks? Why do people engage in social distancing? Why do people actually have public radio in the first place, right? If that is the logic of collective action here. And the answer can be found in the last term of this equation, because we can deal with some of these problems with a fourth term here, which is D, and that is the selective incentive. In other words, it's something that you get only if you cooperate. Now, if you're familiar with public radio, you'll know that the thing that people get if they contribute, they get like a coffee mug or a tote bag, right? That's the little trinket that they get for cooperating. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of a stupid or cheap sort of little incentive. But note that when we talk about selective incentives, they don't necessarily have to be material, right? You might get the tote bag, which is worthless, but it has something emblazoned on it. You get to wear it around, demonstrate to people what you like and who you are. People can derive meaning from that, and that can have a symbolic value to them. Right? If you are praised or somebody nods at you affirmatively in the street for wearing a mask, or you hear public officials saying it's really important and we really thank you for engaging in this behavior, you're being a good member of our community, let's say, that can also provide a symbolic value. So it doesn't have to be material, right? It doesn't have to be a sort of little actual trinket. And I want to note that it doesn't also have to be positive. It doesn't have to be a reward. It could be the avoidance of a punishment. So in the case of a pandemic, it's not like we're going out and rewarding, giving people little trinkets for wearing masks. We are imposing fines and fees on establishments that don't require the wearing of those masks. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester, because sometimes those negative incentives can be effective and sometimes they are not. But in any case, there's something that you get or you get to avoid only if you engage in cooperative behavior, right? Which is why we think about it as selective. So the point is that just because these collective action problems exist doesn't mean that we're consigned to that fate. We can find ways of helping people deal with them. And we look through the course of this semester, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these today. There are two general types of options that governments and societies have when it comes to solving the collective action problem. The first thing involves lowering C, lowering the costs. And you can do this by, for example, clearly communicating about risks. Not everybody is a public health expert, and that's fine. But that means that we need people who are in charge to clearly communicate about what the risks are so that people know what to do. That can lower the costs of engaging in cooperative behavior. Additionally, you can think about economic and social supports during periods of quarantine or safer home orders. That when you're worried about your livelihood, your ability to put food on the table, or your ability to stay in your house or apartment, if you are quarantining or staying at home to prevent the spread of the disease, if you're worried about those things, you might have an incentive to go back out and not engage in cooperative behavior. But economic and social supports during periods of quarantine can actually help people engage cooperatively in health behaviors. Similarly, easing access to testing and PPE, which are not free necessarily, or medical care, which is not free, easing access to those things can also help people engage in cooperative public health behaviors. Finally, we can think about another kind of options we have is to increase selective incentives or increase D. This might mean, in some cases, social or monetary incentives to mask. Now, I don't mean necessarily giving people a little reward for masking or engaging in social distancing, but it might be engaging in rhetorical or communicative action, praising people for doing that kind of behavior. It might also involve, for institutions, imposing some sort of penalty for not requiring that behavior as well. So as we're going to see, our ability to engage in both of these strategies varies, and not every country does it the same way, and not even every state or city does it in the same way. When we talk about dealing with some of the collective action problems that make pandemics worse, these are the two kinds of things that we're going to be talking about. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about risk communication as something that can help lower the cost of collective action. So that is the end of the first part of this lecture. You can take a break now. You can complete quiz questions 1 to 3, and then just take a short break. This is the end of the first part of the lecture 4. And when you're ready, you can go to the video for part 2.